probably will continue to be one of the world's greatest epidemics. But the question remains, should a big-time drug dealer be sentenced to death for it compared to, let's say, murderers, sexual predators? I know the logical answer, but here are a few reasons why drug dealers who are distributing huge quantities of drugs should not be given the death penalty. First of all, drug dealing is a crime that involves the unauthorized sale of certain consumable substances such as marijuana and heroin. A drug dealer is a person who sells the controlled substances. The unauthorized sale of prescription medication can also be considered as drug dealing, and in some cases may be a major problem in some communities, which is why punishment should most definitely be given to the dealer. But the question is, should we really be executing these people for only selling the drug instead of giving a punishment? Here is an image of the coffin of executed heroin trafficker Nguyen Tuong Van as his brother puts him into a hearse. Nguyen was executed by Singapore after being caught smuggling heroin through Shanghai. Now, let's take for example that a man murdered another man, then he would be taken to jail for the rest of his life and might come out of jail in 20 years rather than his whole life. So if you think about the murderer, he killed someone and yet was not executed. But if we take Nguyen, he was executed for doing a small illegal act. But because of Singapore's strict execution laws, the number of drug traffickers arrested each year has declined by 2/3, from over 6,000 in the early 1990s to about 2,000 last year, which is a major improvement. Elaborating on the point made now, in certain countries, illegal importing, exporting, sale, or possession of drugs constitutes capital offenses that may result in the death penalty. According to a 2011 article by the Lawyers Collective, an NGO in India, they say that 32 countries impose capital punishment for offenses involving narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. On the other hand of this, though, is the fact that most big-time drug dealers kill. On March 15, 1988, the New York Times headline was "Brutal Drug Gangs Wage War of Terror." The article states, "Giving our judges the ability to impose the death penalty is one of the many steps that should be taken. Drug dealers and their minions have sunk to a new level of ruthless indifference for human life. It's time we make the punishment fit the crime." Also, another question remains. Should drug dealers be responsible for the overdose of a buyer? Actor Philip Seymour Hoffman overdosed on heroin purchased from Marcus A. Barrage. Barrage pleaded not guilty to his superseding indictment alleging, among other things, that he had unlawfully distributed heroin and that death resulted from the use of that substance, thus subjecting Barrage to a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence under the penalty enhancement provision of the Controlled Substances Act. Now, I feel as though that should not have been Marcus's fault. If a person willingly buys narcotics and abuses it to the point of death, that should not be the responsibility of the seller. Yes, he sold drugs, but 20 years. According to DailyMail.co, George Johnson murdered a man in 1986 for just $3. He was freed in 2006, and 5 years later, he battered to death 89-year-old widow Florence Habish for $25 as she made a cup of tea. The alarming numbers, described as totally unacceptable by MPs, show 275 killers on life terms were let out during 2010 and 2011. Of these, 32 served less than 10 years. Now, I know it depends on the state, but how do you logically determine that this drug trafficker should spend 20 years in jail and this murderer gets to get out on good behavior? The goal of drug dealing is mostly always about money and not just to go around killing people. They really aren't harming anyone except the government with illegal activity, but compare that to the Zodiac Killer or Jack the Ripper or Ted Bundy. They deserve and or deserve death row, not some kingpin trying to make thousands or millions. Changing the system from the inside out requires more than just bipartisan support at the top levels of government. It will also require local lawmakers and officials to meet calls for greater accountability in policing and address the social and economic factors driving up crime rates in their cities and states. These images here show people protesting the justice system, the legalization of a certain drug. It's showing that protesting can help something. So the question does remain, should drug traffickers trafficking large quantities of drugs be sentenced to the death penalty? I think not.